The morning fog had not yet lifted over Cedar Ridge when a woman in a faded gray coat pushed open the door of a roadside diner and asked for a table near the window. She ordered black coffee, 2 eggs, and a slice of toast, speaking softly, almost invisibly, the way people do when they want to be forgotten. Nobody in that diner knew her name. Nobody knew that the quiet woman eating breakfast alone was the newly appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, traveling under no title, no badge in sight, only a notebook tucked beside her plate. Soon afterward, the most powerful man in town walked through that same door, glanced at her once, and decided without a single question that she looked like trouble. Before the eyes of dozens of stunned customers, he snapped handcuffs around her wrists in the middle of the diner, smiling as if he had just saved the town from something terrible. He had no idea that the woman he humiliated held more authority than anyone he had ever answered to in his life, and that his own future was about to collapse in front of the very people who once called him a hero. Cedar Ridge, Montana, rested quietly at the edge of the mountains. It was a town so small that everyone recognized everyone else's truck before they recognized the driver. For far too long, Sheriff Wade Halbrook had been the loudest voice in that town, the man whose name appeared on plaques, whose face smiled from the front page of the local paper, and whose word was treated less like law enforcement and more like law itself. People trusted him the way people trust a habit, without asking questions, without looking too closely. He called it order. Others quietly called it something else, though few dared to say so out loud. That morning, none of that history mattered yet because a stranger's SUV had rolled into town beneath the dim gray light, and nobody had noticed her arrive. Camille Vaughn was sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind of woman who noticed exits before she noticed decor. She had only recently been sworn in as director, and instead of settling behind a desk in Washington, she had chosen to travel unannounced through small towns where complaints about local law enforcement had piled up for far too long without consequence. She dressed plainly on purpose. No tailored suit, no government vehicle with federal plates, just a rented car and a worn coat that made her look like anyone else passing through. She wanted to see towns the way ordinary people saw them, not the way officials performed for cameras. Cedar Ridge was simply the next stop on a list that had grown far too long. She kept that list folded inside her notebook, updated every time another complaint reached her desk, unanswered. She had spent the drive in from the highway studying the town from behind the wheel, noting the boarded storefront near the gas station, the single blinking traffic light, the church with a hand-painted sign advertising a bake sale that had clearly already happened. Small towns revealed themselves through details like these long before anyone said a word. She parked outside the diner while the light was still gray and thin and sat for a moment in the driver's seat, watching the town wake up slowly around her, porch lights flicking off one by one. Before she had ever set foot in Cedar Ridge, her office had already compiled a thin but troubling file on the county, a handful of anonymous letters, 2 unresolved civil complaints filed at different points in the past, and a pattern noted almost in passing by an analyst reviewing arrest statistics across the state. The pattern showed one county consistently detaining more people per capita than any comparable town its size, with almost no cases ever reaching a courtroom. None of it was conclusive on its own. Taken together, it was enough to justify a quiet, unannounced visit, the kind that relied on nothing but patience, and a willingness to sit still long enough for the truth to introduce itself. She had learned over years of fieldwork, long before her appointment, that the most revealing moments rarely happened in interviews or press conferences. They happened in diners, in waiting rooms, in the small, unscripted moments when officials believed no one important was watching. It was why she carried no credentials visible to the eye, no lanyard, no insignia, nothing that might alter the behavior of the very people she had come to observe. She wanted Cedar Ridge exactly as it was, not the polished version it might have offered a known federal visitor. Inside, a handful of regulars sat scattered across the booths, trading small talk about weather and football, the comfortable noise of a town that believed nothing ever truly went wrong there. Nora Whitfield, the owner, moved between tables with a coffee pot in hand, greeting each customer by name, the way she had done for years. When Camille stepped inside, Nora offered her a warm nod and pointed toward an open booth near the window. treating her exactly the way she treated every stranger passing through, with plain, unthinking hospitality that asked no questions and expected none in return. Camille sat down, ordered quietly, and pulled out a small notebook, the kind investigators use out of habit rather than necessity. She wrote nothing dramatic, only observations, the pace of the town, the way people spoke to each other, the small signs that told her more than any official report ever could. She watched the door open and close as customers drifted in. Farmers in worn jackets, a young mechanic still smelling faintly of motor oil, and an elderly couple who split a single plate of pancakes without needing to ask for 2 forks. She watched how the room shifted almost imperceptibly whenever a police vehicle rolled past outside, shoulders straightening, voices dropping half a register. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what she had been trained to catch. Then the door swung open harder than it needed to, and Sheriff Wade Halbrook stepped inside, filling the doorway the way he filled every room he entered, chest forward, eyes already scanning for something to correct. Howe was built like a man who still believed intimidation was a form of leadership, and he had long since stopped distinguishing between authority and entitlement. His gaze moved across the diner out of habit, cataloging faces he recognized until it landed on Camille, a black woman he did not know, sitting alone, writing quietly in a notebook. Something in him tightened immediately, the way it always did when the familiar picture of his town included someone unfamiliar. He did not walk over right away. Instead, he stood near the counter, watching her the way a man watches something he has already decided to be suspicious of. Nora noticed the shift in his posture and felt a small twist of unease in her stomach, though she said nothing, because saying something to Wade Halbrook had never once changed his mind about anything. Deputy Grant Mercer trailed in behind him, carrying the quiet discomfort of someone who had learned to read his boss's mood before it fully formed, the way a man learns to read weather he cannot control. The room, which moments earlier had felt easy and ordinary, began to tighten without anyone quite understanding why. Wade finally crossed the diner floor, his boots striking the tile with unnecessary weight, and stopped directly beside Camille's table. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask permission. He simply planted himself there, arms crossed, studying her the way he studied every stranger who did not immediately explain their presence to his satisfaction. Camille looked up calmly, unbothered, her fork still resting against her plate. Around them, conversations slowly died down, replaced by the particular silence that falls over a room when people sense something is about to happen and decide it is safer to watch than to speak. Wade's voice, when it came, carried the practiced authority of a man who expected no resistance. He asked for identification, not as a request, but as an order dressed up as one. Camille set down her fork, met his eyes without flinching, and asked evenly, "What exactly gives you the legal basis to demand it?" The question landed harder than she intended, not because it was aggressive, but because nobody in that diner had ever heard anyone speak to Sheriff Halbrook that way, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Wade's jaw tightened, and something behind his eyes hardened into certainty. The dangerous kind of certainty that had guided every wrong decision he had ever made without consequence. He asked why she was in town, who she had come to see, and where she was staying, firing the questions quickly, the way a man does when he wants answers to arrive faster than thought. Camille answered each one with the same unhurried calm, giving him nothing false but nothing more than necessary either, careful not to reveal the one detail that would end the confrontation instantly. She was not there to end it instantly. She was there to watch exactly how far it would go, the way a physician watches a fever run its course before choosing when to intervene. Her steadiness seemed to irritate him more than any hesitation could have. Wade had built his reputation on reading people quickly, on trusting his gut over paperwork, and her composure did not fit the story he had already begun telling himself. He muttered that innocent people answered questions fast, that hesitation was its own kind of confession, ignoring the fact that Camille had hesitated at nothing at all. A few of the regulars, longtime admirers of the sheriff, nodded along under their breath, quietly agreeing after years of assuming his instincts were always right, because questioning him had always felt like more trouble than it was worth. Nora stepped closer, setting down the coffee pot, her voice gentle but firm as she tried to smooth the tension, reminding Wade that the woman had done nothing but order breakfast like everyone else in the room. He waved her off without even looking at her, the same way he dismissed anything that did not confirm what he had already decided. Deputy Grant shifted his weight near the counter, arms crossed, eyes flicking between his boss and the stranger. A small, uneasy voice in the back of his mind whispered that something about this did not sit right. Yet he said nothing aloud, just as he had remained silent so many times before. Camille asked once more, calmly, precisely, what legal grounds justified an interrogation over breakfast. It was not defiance. It was a simple, exact question, the kind a lawyer might ask, the kind that exposed the absence of any real justification the moment it was spoken aloud. Wade had no clean answer, and the lack of one, rather than giving him pause, seemed to inflame him further, as though her calm control were itself the offense. His hand moved toward his belt, and the air in the diner shifted from tense to dangerous in the span of a single breath. He announced loudly enough for the whole room to hear that he had every right to search her, that suspicious behavior was justification enough in his town, and that he intended to find out exactly who she was one way or another. Camille did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She simply looked at him, steady and unblinking, and said that he was making a mistake he would not be able to undo. Wade gave a short, humorless laugh, the laugh of a man who had never once believed the word mistake could apply to him, not after years of being cheered for every decision he made. An older man 2 booths away, a retired mechanic named Otis, who had known Wade since childhood, cleared his throat and suggested quietly that maybe the sheriff should just let the woman finish her breakfast in peace. Wade shot him a look sharp enough to end the suggestion before it fully left the air. And Otis, like so many others in that room over the years, decided the matter was not worth pressing further. It was a small moment, barely noticed by most of the diner, but Camille caught it and filed it away alongside everything else. Another quiet thread in a pattern she was only beginning to unravel. She asked him plainly whether he intended to detain her without any charge, without any warrant, based on nothing more than the fact that she was a stranger he did not recognize. Wade's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. He straightened instead of answering, reaching for the cuffs clipped at his belt, the gesture itself functioning as a kind of confession, an admission that no legal justification existed, and none was coming. The cuffs came out fast, the metallic click echoing unnaturally loud against the quiet clatter of dishes and low murmurs around them. Wade pulled her hands behind her back with more force than the moment required, snapping the cuffs shut with the satisfaction of a man closing a case he had already decided was solved before it began. Several customers pulled out their phones instinctively, recording without fully understanding why. It was the instinct people had when something felt wrong yet impossible to stop. A few laughed nervously. It was the uneasy laughter of people who did not know whether to object or simply survive the moment by staying silent, letting the phones in their hands object for them. Wade straightened, chest puffed, and announced to the room that this was exactly why Cedar Ridge stayed safe, that a sheriff who trusted his instincts was worth more than 100 pages of procedure. Nobody in the diner cheered, though a few offered small, uncertain nods, the kind people give when they have spent years trusting a man's authority more than their own judgment. Camille said nothing. She did not resist, did not raise her voice, did not struggle against the cuffs biting into her wrists. She simply watched him, memorizing every word, every gesture, every face in that room that chose silence over intervention, filing it all away with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. Nora stood frozen behind the counter, hand pressed to her mouth, disbelief and anger fighting for space behind her eyes, torn between the urge to shout and the fear of making things worse for a woman she had known for only a short while. Deputy Grant took a half step forward, some instinct telling him to intervene, but the years of habit, the years of deferring to Wade's judgment without question, held him rooted in place, his boots suddenly feeling nailed to the tile floor. Wade gripped Camille's arm and guided her toward the door, narrating his own heroism to no one in particular, as though the silence of the room were agreement rather than shock. The bell above the door rang once as they stepped outside into the cold morning air. Camille's expression was unreadable, calm in a way that unsettled anyone paying close attention. Outside, the town looked exactly as it had when she had first arrived. Quiet streets, parked trucks, a flag hanging still in the windless morning. Wade walked Camille toward his patrol car, still talking, still congratulating himself, oblivious to the sound gathering behind him. low at first, then unmistakable, the deep hum of engines approaching from beyond the edge of town. Deputy Grant, following a few steps behind, was the first to notice the shapes emerging through the thinning fog. 3 black SUVs moved in careful formation, their government plates catching the early light as they slowed and turned onto Main Street, their headlights cutting cleanly through the last of the mist. The vehicles rolled to a stop directly in front of the diner. The doors opened in near-perfect unison, revealing agents dressed in dark suits who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who did this every day. Wade froze mid-sentence, his hand still resting on Camille's arm, watching as one agent stepped forward and asked in a voice utterly devoid of small talk where they could find Director Vaughn. For a moment, Wade misunderstood entirely. Some part of him assumed this was backup arriving to validate the arrest he had just made with such pride, perhaps even reinforcements sent to congratulate him. He straightened his shoulders and announced with unmistakable satisfaction that he had just apprehended a suspicious individual inside the diner, gesturing toward Camille, still standing beside him in handcuffs. The lead agent's eyes moved slowly from Wade's face down to the cuffs, then up again, and something in his expression shifted. The professional blankness cracked into visible disbelief, the kind of disbelief that comes from watching a stranger casually admit to something catastrophic without realizing it. Deputy Grant, watching closely now, felt his stomach drop. A cold understanding began to form even before anyone said a single confirming word. His mind raced backward through every detail of what had just happened. The agent stepped closer, voice low and precise, and said that the woman standing in handcuffs was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and that Wade had just placed her under arrest without cause, without identification, and without a single legal justification anyone in that street could name. The words landed like a physical blow. Wade's mouth opened, then closed, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his face as the full weight of what he had just done began to settle over him in the cold morning air. The flag above the courthouse suddenly seemed to hang heavier than before. He laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, insisting it had to be some kind of mistake, some kind of trick, refusing to accept that the quiet woman he had humiliated in front of an entire diner could possibly hold that much authority. The agent did not argue. He simply reached for his phone, dialed a number, and soon held it out toward Wade, a voice from Washington on the other end, confirming in clipped, unmistakable terms exactly who Camille Vaughn was and exactly how serious this situation had already become. Wade's face went pale, the color draining from it like water leaking from cracked glass. For the first time in years, he had absolutely nothing to say. Mayor Elaine Barrett arrived soon afterward, alerted by a frantic call from someone inside the diner, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she took in the scene. The federal vehicles, the agents, the handcuffs still locked around the wrists of a woman now confirmed to be the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country. She approached cautiously, her voice trembling as she asked whether it was true. The lead agent's flat answer confirmed every fear settling over the gathered crowd. Nora stood at the diner's entrance, hands still pressed to her mouth, watching the man she had known for years unravel in real time. Deputy Grant felt his knees weaken, the ground beneath his understanding of the town shifting all at once, the whole street somehow narrower than it had seemed earlier. A small crowd had gathered by then, drawn from nearby shops and porches by the unfamiliar sight of federal vehicles parked along Main Street. It was a sight Cedar Ridge had never witnessed in its history. Phones remained raised, though the mood among the onlookers had shifted entirely. The earlier nervous laughter was replaced by a heavy, uncertain quiet, the kind that settles over a crowd once it senses that the story unfolding before it is far bigger than anyone had anticipated. Someone near the back murmured that they had always wondered about Wade, though nobody could quite recall having said so before that morning. Retroactive doubt often arrives only after people finally feel permitted to voice it. Camille finally spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, instructing the agents to leave the handcuffs exactly as they were for a moment longer. The order confused everyone present, including her own team, who exchanged uncertain glances before deferring to her without question because they trusted her judgment and had learned never to second-guess it. She turned to face Wade directly, her expression unreadable, and told him this was not about her comfort or her dignity in that moment, but about something far larger than either of them standing in that cold street. Wade, stripped of every ounce of his earlier bravado, said nothing at all, his eyes fixed somewhere near the pavement. She explained evenly that everything since the moment she walked into that diner had been a test. Not of him alone, but of the entire system he represented, a system that had received complaint after complaint from towns just like this one, complaints that rarely reached anyone with the power to act on them. She wanted to see how a sheriff treated a stranger he assumed had no power. She wanted to see how a deputy behaved when he sensed something wrong but said nothing. She wanted to see how an entire room of witnesses responded when injustice unfolded in plain sight, whether they intervened or simply reached for their phones and watched, letting the footage substitute for their own courage. She turned toward the diner's exterior, noting the small camera mounted above the door, then toward Wade's own body camera, still recording, still capturing everything that had just occurred. She ordered the footage secured immediately, along with any traffic camera recordings near the diner, insisting that nothing be deleted, nothing edited, nothing quietly lost, the way inconvenient evidence so often disappeared in towns accustomed to protecting their own. Wade's hands, still holding the small key to the cuffs he had used only moments before, trembled slightly as the reality of consequence finally reached him, arriving far later than it should have. Mayor Barrett tried to interject, offering something close to an apology on behalf of the town, but Camille raised a hand gently, silencing her without harshness. She said this was not the moment for apologies, but for facts, and facts required documentation, not sentiment. She instructed her team to begin securing Wade's office immediately. Every file, every record, every piece of paperwork connected to his service. She treated the request not as punishment, but as procedure. It was the very procedure Wade himself had ignored for far too long, year after year, without a single person in a position to stop him. Soon afterward, agents moved through the small sheriff's office with quiet efficiency, boxing files, copying hard drives, cataloging evidence under fluorescent lights that had never illuminated so much scrutiny before. What they found during the initial review painted a picture far darker than a single reckless arrest. Reports of unlawful detention stretched back years, residents held without charge, property seized without warrants, and small business owners pressured into silence rather than risk losing their livelihoods to a man who treated the badge as personal property rather than public trust. It was theft disguised as official authority. Deputy Grant sat across from one of the federal investigators, hands clasped tightly together, and admitted quietly that he had wanted to report some of it before, more than once. But fear had always won the argument in his mind. Fear of losing his job, fear of being labeled disloyal in a town too small to offer second chances. Nobody in the room judged him harshly for the admission. Instead, they asked him to help now. For the first time in years, Grant felt the strange relief of choosing courage over comfort. A relief that felt almost physical, like setting down something heavy he had carried without noticing its weight. Nora arrived at the temporary federal office later, carrying a small folder of her own, receipts, notes, and records she had quietly kept whenever something about Wade's behavior struck her as wrong. She had never known what to do with the information. No one in town seemed positioned to challenge him, and she had learned, like everyone else, to keep her observations to herself, tucking them away in a drawer behind the register, the way other people tuck away regret. Handing the folder over felt less like betrayal and more like exhaling after holding her breath for years without realizing it. She told the investigator seated across from her that she had nearly thrown the folder away more than once, convinced it would never matter, and that a woman running a diner had no real power to change anything about a man who controlled the entire county. The investigator assured her otherwise, explaining that cases like this one were rarely built on a single dramatic discovery, but on dozens of small, patient contributions exactly like hers, each one meaningless alone, devastating together. Nora left the office later, feeling lighter than she had in years, the folder no longer hers to carry alone. Word spread through Cedar Ridge with unusual speed, carried not through gossip, but through something closer to relief. Business owners who had quietly paid fines they never fully understood came forward. Families who had watched relatives detained without explanation finally spoke openly about what had happened to them. Each new account added weight to a picture already forming clearly in the minds of the investigators. Together, they formed a portrait of a man who had mistaken fear for respect and silence for support for far too long, propped up by a town that had simply never been given permission to speak. An elderly rancher named Silas Turner came forward first, describing an incident from years earlier when Wade had seized nearly a dozen head of cattle over a boundary dispute that was never properly documented. The cattle were never returned and never accounted for in any official record. A young couple who ran the hardware store on 5th Street described being threatened with a business license revocation after they had questioned an unusually large fine for a violation that did not appear to exist anywhere in the town's code. Story after story arrived in the same pattern: small, specific, and devastating, each one confirming what the last one had already suggested. A schoolteacher named Marlene Hayes described being pulled over repeatedly over a short period along the same stretch of road. Each stop ended without a citation, and each one left her shaking behind the wheel for reasons she had never been able to fully articulate to her husband. A traveling salesman recalled being held for an extended period on suspicion of nothing in particular, released afterward with no paperwork and no explanation, only a warning to drive through Cedar Ridge a little faster next time. Investigators began to notice something else, too. A disproportionate number of these encounters involved people who did not look like they belonged in Wade's mental picture of the town. They were travelers, newcomers, and anyone whose face did not match the narrow idea of who deserved the benefit of the doubt. The pattern extended even into the town's finances. A forensic review of the sheriff's discretionary fund revealed thousands of dollars in seized cash and property that had never been logged through proper channels. Some of it was never returned, even after charges were dropped, or never filed at all. Investigators found handwritten ledgers hidden inside a locked drawer, filled with entries that did not match a single official report filed with the county. The numbers told their own quiet story of years spent operating entirely outside the boundaries of the law he had sworn to uphold. The most damning piece of evidence surfaced almost by accident: an old hard drive recovered from a storage closet containing archive footage nobody had thought to review in years. Investigators pieced together fragments of recordings showing Wade coercing confessions, threatening witnesses with vague but pointed language, manipulating situations to fit conclusions he had already decided upon before any investigation began. The footage did not simply confirm suspicion. It shattered any remaining doubt, turning years of whispered rumor into an unbroken chain of documented fact. One recording in particular stopped the review team cold. It had been made years earlier and showed Wade alone with a young man in a holding cell, his voice calm and almost friendly, as he explained in plain terms that a signed statement would make everyone's day easier, while resistance would only prolong an outcome already decided. The young man on the recording signed the statement, and the case against him was soon closed, based entirely on a confession that investigators now understood had been engineered rather than earned. Camille watched the recording once in silence, then asked for it to be preserved, exactly as found, untouched, unedited, ready for whatever accountability still awaited. Mayor Barrett watched portions of the recovered footage in stunned silence. Her earlier defensiveness collapsed into something closer to shame. In a quiet meeting with federal investigators, she admitted that she had heard whispers over the years and had dismissed complaints as isolated or exaggerated. She had chosen to protect the town's image rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. She did not attempt to excuse the choice. She simply acknowledged it. And Camille, listening carefully, noted that acknowledgement was the necessary first step toward anything resembling repair, though it would not be the last. Under Camille's direction, an independent investigation was formally opened, separate from local authority entirely, ensuring nothing could be buried or softened by familiar relationships. Wade was suspended immediately, stripped of his badge, his weapon, and every ounce of authority he had spent his career accumulating. Records were seized in full, and federal oversight moved into a role the town had never expected to need. Soon, the man once celebrated on the front page of the local paper had become the subject of a formal criminal inquiry. His name now appeared beside words like misconduct and abuse of power, rather than hero and protector. Wade requested a private conversation with Camille before formal charges were finalized, and she agreed, curious more than anything, to hear what remained of the man once the authority had been stripped away. They sat across from each other in a small, sparse room. The silence between them was heavier than any words that had passed in the diner earlier. He finally asked the question that had clearly haunted him since the cuffs went on someone far more powerful than himself. Why had she not simply told him who she was and ended it immediately, sparing them both the spectacle that followed? Camille answered without hesitation, her tone even and almost patient. She told him that if she had resisted, if she had announced her title the moment he approached, he would have folded instantly, not out of respect for the law, but out of fear of consequence, and the truth about how he treated ordinary people without power would have stayed hidden exactly the way it always had. She said real authority did not need to shout to be recognized. It revealed itself most clearly in moments when no one expected to be watched, moments that never appeared on plaques or front pages. Wade sat with that truth, something shifting behind his eyes. It was not quite remorse, but it was the beginning of understanding. He admitted quietly that the moment he saw her, before she said a single word, he had already decided who she was and what she deserved, and that instant decision had unraveled everything he thought he had built throughout his service. Camille told him plainly that he had lost long before the handcuffs. The instant prejudice replaced procedure in his mind, and that everything after that had simply been the slow arrival of a consequence already set in motion. He quietly asked whether there was anything he could have done differently once the questioning began. Camille told him the truth, that the moment for a different outcome had passed. The second he decided a stranger's face was reason enough for suspicion, long before he ever opened his mouth to ask a single question, it was not the answer he wanted, but it was the only honest one available. And something in his posture seemed to finally accept it, the last of his old certainty draining out of him. In that small, quiet room, he asked one more question before the meeting ended, his voice smaller than she had heard it since their encounter, wondering aloud how many other officers across how many other towns were making the exact same decision in the exact same instant, without anyone ever arriving to stop them. Camille did not offer him comfort because comfort was not what the question deserved. She told him that was precisely why her office existed and why she had chosen to spend her mornings sitting quietly in diners instead of behind a desk. The only way to find those moments was to be present for them before anyone had reason to hide them. She stood to leave, then paused at the door and told him one final thing, not as director to sheriff, but simply as one person speaking honestly to another. She said that most people who abused power did not think of themselves as villains, and that Wade likely still believed somewhere underneath the wreckage of that morning that he had only ever been trying to keep his town safe. The tragedy, she said, was not that he was cruel by nature, but that no one had ever required him to ask whether his instincts were fair. By the time anyone finally did, the damage had already reached far beyond a single diner booth. Deputy Grant, informed of the conversation later, made his decision without hesitation, agreeing to cooperate fully with the investigation, providing testimony, records, and first-hand accounts of patterns he had witnessed, but never challenged. It was not an easy choice in a town where loyalty had long been mistaken for silence, but it was finally the right one, and something in him settled the moment he made it. A weight lifted rather than added, the first steady breath he had taken in longer than he could remember. He spent an extended period with investigators, walking them through incidents he had tried for years to forget. A traffic stop that never should have ended in an arrest. A report he had been told to file differently than what he had actually witnessed, and a night he had spent awake wondering whether he should have said something and never did. Each memory came out slowly, reluctantly, but once the first one surfaced, the rest followed with less resistance, as though naming one truth finally gave him permission to name the others. By the time it ended, he felt less like a man confessing and more like a man finally exhaling. A community meeting was called later, the largest gathering Cedar Ridge had seen in years. Residents filled the small town hall, shoulder to shoulder, uncertain what to expect. Camille stood at the front of the room, dressed exactly as she had been that first morning in the diner, plain, unassuming, entirely herself. She did not speak about the arrest, did not dwell on her own experience, choosing instead to speak about responsibility and the fragile difference between power exercised lawfully and power exercised through habit and unchecked assumption, a difference that could not survive in silence. She reminded the room gently but firmly that the law existed to protect everyone equally, not selectively, not conditionally, not only for those who fit a familiar picture of who belonged and who did not. She spoke of the countless towns like theirs where silence had allowed small abuses to grow unchecked for years. She made clear that federal oversight would remain in place until real, lasting reform took root. Not performative promises, but measurable, accountable change, the kind that could be verified and revisited rather than simply announced and forgotten. She spoke, too, about the people in that diner who had stood by recording rather than intervening, not to shame them, but to remind them that courage did not always require heroics, that sometimes it required only a single sentence spoken at the right moment, a simple objection that could have changed the entire shape of that morning. Nobody in the room interrupted her. Nobody looked away. For once, the silence in Cedar Ridge felt less like avoidance and more like listening. An older man near the back of the hall raised his hand and asked in a voice thick with something between guilt and grief what the town was supposed to do now, how a place could rebuild trust after learning the very institution meant to protect it had spent years quietly betraying that trust instead. Camille considered the question carefully before answering, telling him that trust was not restored through statements or ceremonies, but through consistency, through years of small, verifiable decisions made the right way, long after anyone was still paying close attention. It would not happen quickly, she said, and it would not happen because anyone declared it finished. She announced that her office would establish a direct channel for residents to report future concerns, entirely independent of local leadership, ensuring no complaint could again be quietly filed away in a drawer or dismissed as exaggeration. Mayor Barrett, standing near the front of the room, nodded slowly, accepting the arrangement not as an insult, but as a necessary correction, one she herself had failed to establish over years of looking the other way. Nora, seated near the back beside two of her regular customers, felt something in her chest loosen slightly. It was the particular relief of watching a wrong finally being named out loud in front of the very people who needed to hear it. Wade was escorted from the town under quiet federal custody soon afterward, facing a growing list of charges tied to years of documented misconduct. Deputy Grant was appointed acting sheriff on an interim basis. It was a decision met with cautious optimism rather than immediate celebration. The town was still adjusting to the idea that authority could be questioned, examined, and corrected rather than simply obeyed without thought. Nora reopened her diner later, wiping down the same window booth where the entire story had begun. She was uncertain whether anyone would return after everything that had unfolded. To her quiet relief, the tables filled again, slowly at first, then steadily, as though the town needed the familiar rhythm of ordinary mornings to begin processing what extraordinary mornings had revealed. Life resumed, altered in ways that would take time to fully understand, but resumed nonetheless, one coffee refill at a time. Camille returned to that same diner one final time before leaving Cedar Ridge, sliding into the same window booth, ordering the exact same breakfast she had ordered earlier. Black coffee, 2 eggs, a slice of toast. This time, as she settled into her seat, something in the room shifted immediately. Recognition swept through customers, old and new, and one by one, without anyone directing them to. People rose quietly to their feet. It was not deference to her title, not performance for cameras that were not even present, but something quieter and more genuine, an acknowledgement of the composure she had carried through every moment of humiliation, the steadiness that had exposed a truth the town had avoided facing for years. Nora poured her coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from something closer to gratitude, the kind that does not need many words to be understood. An elderly woman 2 tables away leaned toward her husband and whispered that she wished she had spoken up that first morning, when she had sat in that very booth and watched the whole thing happen without ever once opening her mouth. Camille overheard it, as she overheard most things, and offered the woman a small, understanding nod, rather than any words of forgiveness or blame. It was not her place to absolve anyone of their silence. She had come to believe that was a debt each person owed only to themselves. Camille finished her breakfast in the same unhurried silence she had carried when she first arrived. Then she stood, thanked Nora by name, and walked out into a morning far clearer than the fog-covered one that had greeted her on arrival. Outside, her rented SUV waited exactly where she had left it. Soon she was gone, disappearing down the same quiet road that had carried her into town, almost unnoticed, leaving behind a town that would never again mistake a badge for permission. Wade Halbrook faced a lengthy federal investigation in the aftermath. The badge he once wore with careless pride was replaced by a case file thick with documented abuse, witness statements, and recovered footage that no attorney could argue away. Cedar Ridge's law enforcement system underwent significant reform. Oversight tightened, procedures rewritten, accountability finally given real teeth rather than empty language on a wall plaque nobody had ever bothered to read closely. The town slowly began to understand a lesson it had avoided for far too long, that a badge did not grant power beyond the law, only the responsibility to uphold it faithfully, and that silence, however comfortable, was never truly neutral. Grant, settling into his new role, made a quiet promise to himself that no complaint filed in his office would ever again disappear into a drawer, that every voice, however small the town, deserved to be heard rather than managed. He began holding open office hours regularly, something Cedar Ridge had never seen from its sheriff's department before, sitting across a plain table from anyone who wanted to speak, listening more than he talked, writing everything down whether or not it seemed important at first glance. Slowly, cautiously, residents began to trust the process again, not because they were told to, but because they watched it work. They watched complaints being followed through to their conclusions instead of vanishing the moment the door closed. Nora kept a photograph behind her counter. It was nothing dramatic, just a small printed image of the empty window booth taken on an ordinary afternoon. A quiet reminder to herself of how easily comfort could curdle into complicity if no one paid attention. She never explained it to customers who asked, only smiled and said it reminded her to keep her eyes open. And most people, sensing there was a longer story behind it, simply let the matter rest. Camille Vaughn left no farewell speech behind, no dramatic final statement, only the quiet example of a single, unhurried morning that had unraveled years of hidden injustice. She moved on to the next town on her list, unnoticed, unannounced, carrying nothing but a notebook and the same plain gray coat, ready once again to sit quietly in some other diner, order breakfast, and simply watch. Somewhere down another highway, in another small town, no one had yet learned to question authority. A similar morning was already waiting to unfold. Another quiet stranger preparing to sit at another window booth. Another sheriff about to make a decision he did not yet know would define him. True justice, she understood better than most, rarely arrived with noise. It arrived quietly, patiently, and it never, ever answered to a badge worn without conscience.